So I'd like you to join me in welcoming and thanking our second speaker who's joining us for our second seminar of the 22-23 Gilbray Annual Seminar Series. Before I introduce May, I will begin by giving honour and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. This is the first time I've had to do a land acknowledgement, so apologies for my pronunciation. I am learning with my Scottish accent. So we'd like to give thanks to the traditional inhabitants of the land where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognise our responsibility as guests to respect and honour the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. This series will create opportunities for the exchange of ideas and stimulate discussion amongst researchers, graduate and undergraduate students, community members, and older adults. This year, our seminars are exploring the theme of community gerontology, and we're thrilled to have Dr. Michi Saagiig here via Zoom to present her seminar entitled Restoring Apocalypse, Intergenerational Storytelling on Aging Futures. I'd just like to ask that you keep yourself on mute during the presentation to avoid background noise. The intention is for me to present for about 40 minutes, leaving about 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end of the session. Do feel free to type your questions into the chat box at any time, and we can read on your behalf during the question and answer session, or you'll be able to unmute yourself to ask Dr. Chazan directly during the Q&A. So, Michi Saagiig is a professor, parent and activist who's been living in Michi Saagiig Anishinaabe territory in Peterborough, Canada since 2013. May is an associate professor in gender and social justice at Trent University, and she leads a research program called Aging Activisms and is an executive member of the Trent Centre for Aging and Society. Through intergenerational storytelling and arts-based research, her scholarship aspires towards the expansive work of imagining and making alternative, that is anti-capitalist, decolonial, crip, queer, just futures in uncertain times, challenging dominant conceptions of aging, activism and social change. Please do join me in welcoming Dr. Michi Saagiig.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to speak as part of this incredible series. So I'm zooming in with you today from Michi Saagiig Anishinaabe territory, Peterborough, where I live and work as a settler, professor, parent, activist. Very grateful to be making my home on this beautiful land. I want to extend my gratitude to Trent, the Department of Gender and Social Justice, and the Trent Center for Aging and Society, and to the CRC for supporting my program of research, Aging Activisms. My friend and colleague, Madeline Wheatung, had a significant contribution to the analysis that I'll offer today. At the time of this research, she was a research assistant with Aging Activisms. Madeline is a brilliant Michi Saagiig scholar, and some of this talk comes from our co-written paper, Carving a Future Out of the Past and the Present, Rethinking Aging Futures, published in the Journal of Aging Studies. I also want to acknowledge Melissa Baldwin for their ongoing research assistance, and shout out to the rest of my research team for all of the incredible, and to all the incredible participants who have been part of my research. This art installation was created in October 2019 as part of a 2-day arts-based research workshop called Imagining Our Futures. This workshop took place in Michi Saagiig Anishinaabe territory, in what has been known for millennia as Nogojuanong, the place at the foot of the rapids, and which now includes the city of Peterborough. The research involved an arts-based gathering at which 17 participants were invited to imagine what positive futurity might mean in this place, and to consider what would make this community age-friendly. Participants ranged in ages from 20 to 40 and occupied many different social locations. This was the most recent of 7 intergenerational arts-based and storytelling workshops my research team facilitated, all between 2015 and 2019. As with all of the aging activism's research, it centered perspectives and knowledges of racialized, indigenous, queer, and/or disabled participants, recognizing how, as perspectives that are often missing from academic study, these can offer important epistemological challenges to dominant aging concepts. The base of the installation you see here, made from paint on recycled cardboard, represents Odinabe Jibi, which loosely translates to the river that beats like a heart, which runs through Nogojuanong. Odinabe has been the heart of Michi Saagiig navigation, communication, and sustenance for thousands of years. Teeming with salmon and other life up until the colonial interruptions of industry and locks, Odinabe remains the basis of generativity in Nogojuanong. Layered onto this base are painted stones and paper leaves and salmon, all inscribed with images and words offered by participants in response to our central research questions. What would make this community a good place to grow old or grow older? What would make this community age-friendly? And what do we each need to support our own positive futures? This installation of Odinabe held our collective process of imaginative worlding and knowledge production. The workshop entailed a series of activities, including multiple roundtable discussions, collage making, and the co-creation of this installation. In this talk, I'm going to explore three key themes that emerged in this workshop. The first is aging futures as deeply rooted in place, relations, and community. The second, generativity as extending beyond hetero-reproductive and human centricity. And the third, aging futures as cycles of intergenerational continuance across time. So I'm going to come back to these themes a few times in case this isn't clear right from the beginning. I'm going to show how participants collectively unsettled the colonial conceptions of individualism, human centricity, generativity, and linear time that are embedded in dominant understandings of successful aging futures. I'll also draw on some Indigenous scholars outside of aging studies to think through some of these interventions. At the end of the talk, I'm going to share a personal film which I created earlier this year in 2022 in response to some of what I'm learning in this research. The film, called Dream Beautiful Futures, is about my own process of aging while parenting a child with climate anxiety. While the film reads as a letter to my daughter, it's also less explicitly a letter to the many amazing humans who've been part of aging activisms and to Michi Saagiig land and territory. So I'm going to start with just some large conceptual brushstrokes to set this context. Participants in the Imagining Our Futures workshop offered three critical interventions into the underlying colonial normativity of successful aging and its associated aging studies concepts. First, they disrupted ideas of successful aging as individualistic and placeless. Second, they challenged the heteronormativity and the human centricity within the concept of generativity. And third, they questioned colonial ideas of time and aging as a constant, linear, forward movement towards finality or death. This analysis builds on ongoing scholarly critiques of successful aging. In particular, I draw on Lynn Sandberg and Barb Marshall's project of queering cripping aging futures, in which they sought to disrupt simplistic narratives of happy aging futures. I'll just give you a minute to look at this. This is a Google search from Barb and Lynn's paper in May 2016, Queering and Cripping Aging Futures. And this is some of what came up when they typed in a happy old age. Just have a look at these images for a moment. Sandberg and Marshall reveal the compulsory heteronormativity, able-bodiedness, and able-mindedness of successful aging narratives, showing these as represented by affluent, physically fit, hetero couples, leisurely interacting with their grandchildren. I also draw from Quechua scholar Sandy Grand, who interrogates the dehumanizing settler capital logics implicit in dominant aging narratives. Grand calls for an Indigenous critique of dominant aging narratives that illuminate the ways in which settler logics undermine, if not erase, relations of mutuality, So for example, relationality, reciprocity, kinship, that operate beyond the productivist logics of capital. Taken together, these scholars reveal how dominant narratives like successful aging tend to encode aging with certain colonial capitalist assumptions. Three of these, which I've already alluded to, are especially pertinent to my analysis today. But here they are again, just for clarity. So assumption one, successful aging is placeless. Embedded in dominant narratives are assumptions about later life aspirations for freedom as disconnected from community, land, and place. Picture the images of happy olders jogging on nondescript beaches or riding bicycles along nameless trails. Assumption two, generativity is key to success, and this is about connection to biological kin, grandchildren, which is both human-centric and hetero-reproductive. And assumption three, aging ends in death, which is bad and scary. Here are all the images of success as youthfulness, ableness, avoiding the telltale signs of aging. These are rooted in finality-oriented linear timelines that point to the inevitable and impending dependence, decline, and death. Participants, you will see, challenge these assumptions. In my analysis, I also turned to a number of Indigenous scholars to support and help think through participants' interventions. Many of these scholars are writing outside of aging studies on topics of futurity and intergenerational continuance, and I want to highlight just a few. I draw from a critical understanding that place is central to who we are as people, to community formation, and to how we move and live in the world, resonating with Indigenous modes of accessing and creating knowledge. Here, Anishinaabe scholar Leanne Simpson's writing is helpful and resonates strongly with what I'll show you from this workshop. Simpson's work also helps in thinking about generativity beyond the heteronormative and human-centric frameworks. She describes the radiating relationships that Anishinaabe life depends upon, explaining our knowledge system, the education system, the economic system, and the political system of Michi Saagiig Anishinaabe were designed to promote more life. Our way of living was designed to generate life, not just human life, but the life of all living things. This kind of life-generating framework, rooted in place and land, depicts relationality across generations as embedded in a web of interspecies relationships. So what if we thought about generativity as persisting all life into the future, all species, the river, the rocks, the land? Oyate scholar Kim Talbert further questions notions of intergenerational continuance rooted in biological reproduction. Here she points to the idea of kinship as encompassing family, community relationships that are much wider than colonial nuclear family models. Generativity into the future becomes all about all the children, all the yet unborn. She explains that colonial ontologies separate the material or living and the spiritual or ancestral realms, and that it is fundamentally this that underpins anxieties about death as an ending or intergenerational relationships as fostered only among the living. Many other Indigenous writers also offer alternatives to linear temporalities embedded in successful aging, based on notions of cyclical or spiral time and connections to ancestors past and generations yet unborn. What if we thought about our responsibilities as we age to all of the community's children? And what if ancestor was not necessarily a biological relation? Sandy Grand, who I mentioned already, calls into question death as an end to the aging process, and instead discusses cyclical notions of futurity, where death is followed by rebirth as an ancestor, still active in the lives of generations to come. She points to the medicine wheel framework, which positions birth and death side by side on a circle. And finally, Kyle White, Potawatomi scholar, offers this evocative description of spiraling time. Experiences. Sorry, just noticing some sound. Okay. Experiences of spiraling time may be lived through narratives of cyclicality, reversal, dreamlike scenarios, simultaneity, counterfactuality, irregular rhythms, ironic uncyclicality, slipstream parodies of linear pragmatism, eternality, among many others. The spiraling narratives unfold through our interacting with and responding to and reflecting on the actual or potential actions and viewpoints of our ancestors and descendants. They unfold as continuous dialogues. The narratives also involve the dramas related to our own transformations as we move from being descendants to ancestors through our own lives. So what if successful aging depended on doing the work to become a good ancestor to future generations? These are some of the questions circulating in this research, and I'm going to turn now to what was created and shared in the workshop in 2019. As I do this, I'll be retreading those 3 themes I introduced earlier. So the first theme was rooting aging futures in place. The first theme reflects participants' understandings of positive aging futures as deeply relational to place. Again, this offers a sharp contrast to the unrooted and individualistic assumptions embedded in successful aging narratives. When asked about how they envisioned positive futures, participants never raised desires to travel or imagined aging in nameless elsewheres. Regardless of where they or their families were originally from, so settler or indigenous, their desired aging futures were rooted to the very land on which they live now, Michi Saagiig Anishinaabe territory. It was an interesting finding that when we asked participants what they envisioned for the future, many responded with a significant understanding of Indigenous land knowledge and place-based relationships. Most, if not all, participants could name the territory on which they lived, and they understood their own position in relationship to it. Many also centered the importance of local Indigenous knowledge to aging well in place, describing relationships to Indigenous territory as key to positive aging. Let me give you an example. Charlotte Kennedy, queer settler activist and artist in her 70s, recognized that Indigenous knowledge was central to successful aging in place. She asked, with the times that are coming for my grandchildren, will they have a positive future? Her answer for herself and to the group was, it will depend on us earning the respect of and supporting the wisdom of Indigenous people. She believed that it will be essential that we embrace and respect Indigenous knowledge. These reflections resonated with our wider group discussions. Many participants also indicated the importance of respectful relationships with the land and water of the territory. Bill Gunson, gay activist, retired educator in his 70s, also a settler, said, I thought about the river, and I think that in growing older, we're all in the process of becoming. And I don't think we ever reach the ultimate old. We're just older. So he was reflecting on the Odennabe River as it connects us across generations. His connection between embodied aging and the continuity of the river suggested that maybe generations are connected across time through place in a continual cycle of becoming. Much of our discussion emphasized building community in place through processes of radical care. Several participants also noted that these care relationships occur both in place and to place. Charlotte Kennedy, again here, painted these words on her stone, speak with kindness to water. And she later explained that water molecules change according to how they are treated, and we are mostly water. So how we speak to one another matters. If we speak with kindness and care, it actually has an effect on our whole system. Kennedy's words reflected a wider sentiment through this research, the interconnectedness between the relationship one maintains with place and the relationships we maintain with one another. The importance of place, land, and place-based relationships permeated this workshop, challenging narratives of happy aging futures as placeless, extra-local, and individualistic. They also supersede biological and material notions of relationality. But the second theme was queering and unsettling generativity. The second theme reflects the importance of intergenerational continuance, extending beyond hetero-reproductive and human-centric generativity. Participants describe their commitment to intergenerational relationships, which are expansive, beyond biological ties, and existing within interspecies networks of relationships. Several queer settler participants in the group challenged hetero-reproductive versions of intergenerational connection, describing their extended, multi-gen, chosen families and their roles in raising children who are not biologically theirs. They also felt responsible for the future safety and well-being of all children, whether they were related to them biologically or not. Mary Mumford, mixed ancestry, Cree, Elter, and performance scholar, responded with the following reference to Cree kinship networks, noting how nuclear family models were imposed through colonization. Her words extended temporal frames, typically associated with intergenerational connection, well beyond the grandparent-grandchild relationships, pointing to the active roles of ancestors in fostering belonging and safety. This is what she said. I don't have grandchildren, but in a Cree way, I'm a grandmother to all my siblings' grandchildren. And I try to spend time with them, telling stories about my grandmother, so they remember that, because the teaching is about connections spanning 7 generations, where I stand in the middle. And she continued, there's my mother and father, my grandparents, and then I get to know my great-grandparents through stories from my grandmother, and I have children and grandchildren, all of my siblings, and I have great-grandchildren. The way I grew up, we would feast together, and the elders were there, and all of the kids running around, they became cousins. Like, you know, they're all calling people auntie because they're like your auntie, right? There's lots of good work to be done in community to make it a safe place. But I really believe in that intergenerational work, and that we're all needed as grandparents and aunties or uncles, right? That's important. Lots of kids out there that need us. These powerful words extend generative connections backwards and forwards in time and to a large community or kinship network. Furthermore, many participants over the course of the workshop challenged the human centricity and described nurturing non-human relationships well into the future, very similar to Simpson. For instance, Jen Cole, Algonquin Anishinaabe performer, scholar, and parent in her 30s, connected her relationship with rocks to generativity across extended time. She said, I'm learning a lot about rocks, learning that rocks are grandparents, the oldest ones, and they're big knowledge holders. So some of the work I'm doing is going back to my home territory and ceremonying rocks. And that's been really beautiful. And I think it means I have responsibilities to rocks right now. Lisa von Bieberstein, queer settler, poet, organizer, and parent in their 40s, also reflected on an understanding of generativity that is less human-centric, describing their collage as follows. When I think about the future, I just think about needing to know more about how to live from life around us, considering things from a non-human perspective. My kind of deep motivation and drive is always about bringing people together or bringing and kind of addressing severances and the way we've been removed from our relationships to each other and to non-human life and to the cosmos and things like that. These ideas about generativity extending to non-human life into the future were echoed widely among participants. They considered how notions of generativity might involve connection to and responsibility for our shared futures and all future life. In their discussion about aging well, they described their desires to be connected far into the future and past. So I'm going to turn to my third theme now, which is unsettling linear temporalities of finality. Storytellers challenge the colonial conceptions of time that constrict how we think about both aging and futures. Some describe time as cyclical rather than linear, as connected to cycles of resurgence and recreation rather than tied to an impending end. Early in the workshop, as we reflected on whose aging is deemed successful, participants began to question the fears underpinning societal norms of old age. What one participant identified as the elephant in the room, that is the fear of death. Carol Andrews, queer settler activist in their 60s, said this: "In colonial society, we don't like to talk about death, and other cultures certainly talk about death more. The idea that there is really an end leads to not wanting to talk about aging." This then opened up a much wider discussion about linearity. In fact, it opened up a strong temporal theme that reverberated throughout the rest of the workshop. The continual questioning of two parallel and intertwining fear-centric discourses of finality. The first, fear of individual human aging and the finality of death. And the second, fear of ecological collapse and the end of the world. So to be clear, this research did not set out to explore climate futures, but eco-anxieties around impending climate disasters loomed heavily over all of our discussions about the future. Participants continually revealed that the climate crisis was ever present in their minds, influencing how they thought about their own futures and the futures of young ones in their lives. Some even shared their grief and anxieties over bringing new life into a precarious world and their looming sense of doom or apocalypse. Ironically, these reflections, these apocalyptic reflections, led most clearly to some of the emerging visions of possibility for the future that came out of this work, for a world waiting beyond this one. Von Bieberstein followed Andrews, introducing some of these ideas. They returned frequently over the course of the workshop to the colonial normativity of thinking about futures along a linear timeline and the need for cyclical thinking. So they asked, how do we imagine futures in the context that we find ourselves in? I think it's very brave work. I see it as moving from thinking linearly to thinking cyclically. We seem to think we're on this linear path and we're scared of an ending, which sounds a lot like how we think about aging too. On the closing afternoon of the workshop, Elder Mumford again offered the group a teaching that helped us further shift from colonial assumptions of linearity towards a cyclical understanding of time. She said, in our creation story, there is no dream of the end of the world. In the natural world, there's creation, destruction, and recreation. There's no straight path that's going to end. We're just in cycles. She explained that to her, death is not an end because she considers her relations to include ancestors and future generations. In this way, she expects to remain influential in supporting future generations after she dies and becomes an ancestor. She went on, I'm 75 now, and I'm starting to think of when my time comes. But what I hear people saying is we're concerned about how the children are going to handle it being the climate crisis. But again, what I've come to learn from the elders that I work with is my ancestors, most of them are in touch with me. And I know I'm going to be in touch with my children and grandchildren too, and with the children I adopt along the way who call me Kokum. As facilitator participant Madeline Wheaton, whose influence on this talk I mentioned at the start, then reflected, sometimes I think when we're talking about climate change, we get really human-centric and really focused on how are we going to survive, without thinking about how the world is going along without us needing to manage it. Often we talk about the end of the world. We don't have a lot of expectations of sometimes of what the future is going to look like. But then I also think that the end of this world might not be so bad, you know? There's a lot of hope, I think, when we think about the world changing. Disa von Bieberstein connected Madeline's paradigm shift back to our fears of aging, offering this. Oops, sorry. I was thinking about linear time versus cyclical time. Instead of it being a beginning, middle, end, we think of life constantly going around. If you think about it that way, then you don't have anxiety about aging. In dominant culture, people have the most value and power in their middle age. There's less value placed on children. And as you get older, you're considered less and less valuable and less authoritative. And then it ends. That's how the story goes. But if the story goes, creation leads to recreation, life creates more life, then you don't have that end. It's the same with the climate. If you think about the entire history of the cosmos and you put what's happening right now in that context, then you're in this place where you can be curious about what happens next. So what emerged were ideas about cyclical or spiral time. Participants turned from finality-oriented, anxious discussions about death and the decline of life on Earth towards indigenous notions of cyclical or spiral time. And they connected this shift to dominant anxieties around aging future and to the elephant in the room, death. Against the backdrop of upheaval from climate apocalypse to railway blockades to racial justice uprisings to an ongoing global pandemic, this research invited a collective process of radical imagination in constricted times. Overall, participants articulated desires for futures with intergenerational living and food sharing, accessible community hubs, meaningfully respected Indigenous leadership, extended networks of kinship and community care, compassionate connection to the land, authentic valuing of all life, deep relationship building across human and non-human worlds, and real-time embodied practices of decolonial love. So their visions were revolutionary. Conceptually, this collective visioning offered some interesting alternatives to dominant narratives in our society, to widespread narratives of apocalyptic futures, and to dominant ageist capitalist colonial conceptions of successful aging. Certainly it gives us, as aging studies scholars, some ideas to ponder, some questions to percolate. What if generativity and intergenerational connection reached far back to generations past and far forward to the yet unborn? What if aging successfully is about becoming a good ancestor, fulfilling responsibilities to radiating all future life to continuance? And what if there is a next world waiting, one which we are partly making right now? So I'm going to leave you with these questions, not with any answers, just some questions to percolate for now, and shift gears for the remaining 5 minutes of this talk. This research grinded to a halt in early 2020 when COVID hit, and I was unable to regather this community for a long time. And in fact, I have been unable to regather this community together since then in a safe way. So after a long meandering pandemic journey, which for me also included a medical leave, in January 2022, I plan to reconvene past participants to explore 2 follow-up questions. One was, how do we imagine livable, positive futures now? And the other was, how has this changed through COVID? And then entered Omicron, and this gathering, like several others attempted over the past few years, was also canceled. So I decided to turn the question back on myself. I also decided to take a virtual course with Story Center in Berkeley, at UC Berkeley, to learn a bit of new tech and technique for digital storytelling. So I'm not techie at all, but I had a little bit of time on my hands in lockdown. I've been deeply aware of the vulnerability of aging activism's participants who over many years have shared stories with me. And I thought it might be good for me to try to share back a personal piece from my own life with them, a piece about how the work that we've been doing together continues to reverberate out. So earlier this year, I made this digital story. It's called Dream Beautiful Futures. And as I mentioned, it's a short film about parenting a child experiencing intense climate anxiety and eco grief. I also made it just a couple months after returning from medical leave. So in a way, it also offers a reflection on my own changing embodiment, fear of dying, and aging process. I draw on the decolonial teachings shared with me through aging activisms to explore what it could mean to shift cultural imaginaries of imminent apocalypse to a more reworlding vision of livable futures. It's a very personal piece. I'm just going to come off this thing for a second. So I can see everybody. Yeah, it's a very personal piece, and it's much more personal than any of my previous work. But I wanted to end this presentation by sharing it with you. It's 5 minutes long. It's not very long. And it is, it's a little bit of a hack job of photos found on my cell phone and my own voice and learning a new technology. But I'm going to share it directly from Vimeo, actually, with the hope that you can hear it and see it properly in this format.
Last night you asked me, Mom, what will the world be like when I'm an adult? The panic in your voice, your tender heart. Will it be too late? Will there be any polar bears left? Will we be running from fires all the time? When you decided to have me and Cam, did you know? I wanted to say, it'll be okay. I'll protect you. I'm sorry. Words jumbled, clogged, chest burning where the cancer just was, terror at the thought of leaving you, images of fires, pets stranded, that suitcase, still packed, just like when I was a kid. I wanted to say something soothing, but that suitcase, why? There was always a roof over my head. In the darkness, only these words. Come, Alex. Hold my hand. Breathe with me. In. Out. By dawn I remember years spent imagining futures, sharing hearts, artists, activists, elders, youth, soup, stories, round dances, relationships bestowed with wisdom, all somehow leading to your questions. Whose apocalypse is it? One friend asked. Our apocalypse started in 1492. Go on, urged another. Press your heart up to that tall pine. Is she scared? Sing to Odinabe. Dance that salmon back upstream. 7 generations ago, our ancestors were looking at us right now, asking, what will they need? We have to pick up the bundles they left us. You will be somebody's ancestor one day. What kind of ancestor will you be? Me? Ancestor? I'm not of this land. I love that tree, but I don't know her so well. Where were my ancestors in 1492? Are any of them still there? Remember when our ancestors felt doomed? They survived, kindred spirits said. We share that story. Shtetl on fire, suitcases. Oh, a different apocalypse. My ancestors. Did they leave me bundles? Maybe. Held in community, words creeping back. We are living in a time of great turning, mysterious and uncertain. I can't tell you what the world will be like, but I can tell you this. This is not the end. You have exactly what you need, deep in your cells. Lean on your ancestors now, their courage, their chicken soup, their dreams of better worlds. Ask those hard questions. Start a club. Write a letter. Go on. Whisper to the wind, leap that rainbow, listen to that ladybug. Collect every fallen rose petal. Love beyond the stars. Feel that sunset wash over your body. Paint something colorful for your bubby. Sing, rest, dream. When things get tough, close your eyes. Imagine you're holding my hand. Breathe with me. In, out. You are making the next world right now. Make it as beautiful as you are.
Okay, I'm gonna stop there and open it up for questions or comments or thoughts.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so very much for sharing with us such kind of tender and deep learnings and passions. I think that really radiated throughout your talk, May. So I'll just invite folks to join me in saying thank you so much to Dr. May Chazan for sharing with us today. And as part of our time of giving thanks, I also wanted to open up the floor for any questions or comments that folks might have for May. I see right away we have Peter Whitehouse. If you wanted to unmute yourself perhaps and ask a query, and maybe just before you ask your question, please feel free to also use the chat function if that's a more useful way to ask your query. But take it away, Peter.
Mary, thank you so much. I put my question in the chat as well. So I'm actually out in the woods taking a walk with my mother-in-law, who's 93, and my 2 grandchildren, feeling very intergenerative. So I'm exploring this concept of re-indigenization. I wonder if you could talk about whether that concept resonates at all. This notion that all of us have to find roots, have to find a sense of place, and those of us who may have moved to Canada or from everywhere around the world, still there's this issue of how do we connect to the planet where we are. Can you comment more about that? Thank you so much for your work. By the way, I'm a good friend of Stephen Katz.
Thanks. Well, I can't say that I've thought that much or come across that much a concept of re-indigenization, where I hear like indigenizing your scholarship, indigenizing your methods, indigenizing the university, these kinds of things. It has all kinds of meanings, and some of them are complicated and maybe questionable in my mind. I know that there are a lot of Indigenous scholars like Karen Recollet, Jill Carter, and Dylan Robinson who kind of caution settler scholars away from this idea of indigenizing their methods, because sometimes it can be more of a co-opting of Indigenous knowledge, or kind of a hungry, like Dylan Robinson calls it, like this hunger to know, to use certain ways of knowing. But I don't think that that's what you're talking about. And likewise, the like indigenizing of the academy, for instance, to me is actually about affirmative action, and we should just call it that. Of hiring Indigenous scholars because they've been omitted from these spaces for so long. So I'm all for that. But what I think you are talking about is a teaching, or resonates to me with a teaching that's come through in my research a fair bit, particularly from people like Elder Shirley Williams, who's Anishinaabe language holder, teacher, former professor at Trent, who often will say, you, rather than spending all your time trying to understand our culture in an objectifying way, trying to kind of gaze in, go and learn your own roots, go and learn your own story in order to be able to better understand what your ancestors wanted you to know. And that's sort of what I think maybe is coming through in my film a little bit, is some of those teachings. I mean, again, the film is only 5 minutes long and it's sort of written in a poetic way, so it's not spelling out every single teaching, but this idea of understanding that everybody's roots and everybody's stories and everybody's ancestry holds learning, holds messages, holds stories that are important for us to understand, and that as we look forward into whatever the future is, we need to draw on the stories and the knowledges of our ancestors, all of us collectively, wherever we're originally from. So maybe that's what you're pointing to. And that was a real learning for me. In fact, it sent me in personally in my own life to an entire like family tree project with my kids, and my kids interviewing each of their grandparents to find out stories that they remembered about their grandparents. So now going back 4 generations and all this kind of thing, because I understand that if we have reworlding vision, if we have a vision of actually working towards the world we want to live in, that we have to understand who we are in this place and what role we play in this place and what positions we hold and where we come from. And as somebody of Jewish ancestry, I grew up very commonly actually in a completely assimilated, completely atheist, culturally non-specific household, where none of my own practices in my family were ever, like my own cultural practices were ever celebrated or anything like that. And I have understood only in moving to this territory, starting to work at Trent and through the connections in my own research, I have understood that if I want to do this work, I have to also do the work of understanding who I am and where I come from. And it's been a very big personal learning that has changed the way my family operates, and it has changed the way that I operate on this, and it has deepened my relationships with many of the Indigenous participants and so on in the work that I do, who you saw in that film and in little bits of the slides and stuff like that. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's kind of maybe the where I would chime in on that.
Am I allowed a brief reflection? Yes, yeah. You cannot make re-indigenation a continuation of colonization. And I think you were saying before, you've got to be careful about words that get twisted around. But I'm Celtic, I'm Scottish, I was born in the UK. So to your second point, those are the roots that I'm exploring. So I appreciate your reflections a great deal, and thank you for answering my question. I look forward to other questions.
Great, thanks, Peter, and thank you so very much, May. Kirsten, would you like to voice your query?
Yes, hi. It's nice to see you, May, and thank you so much. Yes, I haven't seen people in person in so long, so it's so nice. As always, it's amazing to see your work come to life in your presentations, and all of your participants and all of their wisdom that they brought to the table. And your own video. I've done a digital storytelling video, and it's hard to be that vulnerable in something you create, because we often take the stories of other people and put it out there. And so I thought what you did was fantastic, and really moving. And I'm curious to know what your daughter thought about it. But I'm wondering too, moving beyond, I know that you work with a lot of activists, so I'm sure they are doing work in their communities to get these narratives change. We think about successful aging and narratives about decline. A lot of the work I do is in, taking up these really problematic narratives. Have you thought about how to get these other stories and ways of thinking, these restorying, the apocalypse and everything, other creative ways of getting it out there, people outside of, your community that you engage with, and outside of the academic community, kind of engaging the public in it more, that are not necessarily already activists or already thinking about how to make a difference in the way they're thinking about aging and their connection to their own histories and ancestors and all of that.
Yeah, I'd actually love, I'd love thoughts and input on that. There were a few ideas, and actually there were a number of plans in the works before COVID hit, which was literally just months after that Imagining Our Futures workshop. And a lot of things got shelved, but there was a discussion of maybe trying to do like an art installation. We have a bunch of art that's been created through aging activism, including that river that you saw with the rocks and the leaves, and collages and films, short media capsules, so many things, zines, poetry. There's just been so much over the years, and we've been talking about trying to do some kind of art installation at a community art hub here at Art Space, or some other space. And then it hasn't really materialized, in part because things were open and closed, and we weren't sure where to go with it. I do love the digital storytelling for its ability to reach people in different places. I haven't been totally brave enough to share that piece very widely yet, because it's, I just made it this year, and it does feel a little raw. But I've been starting to share it back with participants in the work, in mostly just on little Zoom calls and things, because we haven't been able to gather properly. And I've been actually asking participants in the work where they think that these kinds of things might land. So yeah, we're just in the middle of thinking about that. In terms of how my daughter responded to it, well, my older kid, who is in all the photos and has certainly been, my kids homeschooled for 1.5 years at the beginning of the pandemic. So we had, I don't know how many days of pandemic parenting happening at the point in time when I made that. They were kind of part of making it. They helped me choose which photos. They helped, they wanted a picture of the suitcases because it's an image. It was the only photo that we actually took specifically for the film. And they decided, oh, we have to have your Cabbage Patch Kid from when you were a kid, and like my older one took the photo. So they were sort of part of making it. My older one has watched it many times and finds it really fascinating to see, because they've also been to many community events that I've organized and stuff, so over their lifetimes. And so they found it really interesting to see all those things coming together. My younger one can't get through the opening kind of scene without starting to cry, because the whole climate apocalypse situation is just so very, very present for her still. So she, I don't think, has watched it all the way through to the end. But, I think she's getting there. This is almost a whole year ago now that I was making this. So thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Great. I'm just gonna check the chat. Does anyone else have a query that they'd like to ask me at this time? I'm also seeing in the chat, May, just to let you know that a lot of folks are just commenting on how beautiful the film was.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to start to share it. Again, it's a bit more personal than what we usually do as academics, but I do storytelling work. So the work that I do has been so deeply personal to the people sharing their stories that it felt like maybe it was time to flip that back on myself.
This might lead off a little bit from Kirsten's question. I think aging activism has been through so many different events, the intergenerational workshops and the more arts-based workshops and the workshop that you featured throughout your talk. I'm wondering what might be coming. Can I query what might be coming next for aging activisms?
Yeah. So like I said, this work came to a hiatus in March 2020, as all of our lives did. And to disclose the way academic institutions work, unlike most other SSHRC grants, my CRC is funded through SSHRC, but unlike most other SSHRC grants, the CRC refused to pause or extend the work. So basically the clock has been ticking on my CRC grant this whole time, and I haven't been able to, I was 2 years into the second kind of 5-year cycle of the work. So I was sort of right in the thick of doing a lot of a lot of community-based work, and I had to stop. So the reality is I'm not going to be able to finish the project the way that I had hoped for. And I've had to kind of actually grieve the loss of aging activisms, because I love this work and I love this community. And we had 4 different immersive workshops planned that got canceled. So with the like kind of realization, and then I had breast cancer, and I had a 6-month leave. And it's been hard coming back to work and figuring out like how to jump back in. So lots of disruption, but in the realization that I can't actually finish this work the way I had anticipated, it has kind of opened up the possibility of thinking about like what comes next with this. I have 1 year left of funding on this project that's just been kind of running wild since the pandemic hit. And I can't do what I planned, but I am now with community, with many of the folks who have been involved in this work here in community, talking about what can we do in the last year of aging activisms that's not necessarily more research, because it's not going to happen anyway, but might seed something that could live on after aging activisms is no longer. So there's talks of like, we're looking for a better word, but like, what would it mean to seed like an intergenerational like think tank that could come together around different issues in the community and be there to gather when needed? Or what would it look like to create some sort of the beginnings of some sort of intergenerational festival that wasn't necessarily academic, but that drew on the wisdom and the learning from this kind of work. So I'm wide open at this point, and I'm just having small discussions with some of the people who have been most influential in this work to like, what can we do with 1 year left of research funding that could be a bit reworlding in itself, like that could just fill a need that in the community and draw on what we've learned from the work to continue.
Thanks, May. I'll look forward to seeing what comes. I'm sure folks, if they want to stay tuned, they can head to agingactivisms.org. If I can put a plug in for your project's website, maybe to stay abreast of what's happening. So I'm taking a look at the time, and we're just at time here. So I would invite everyone here to join me in giving a round of applause of thanks to Dr. Michi Saagiig for sharing so generously with us today. Thank you again very much, May. And just to note that our next Gilbrea Center seminar series is coming up in 2023. So that's taking place February 2nd, which is a Thursday from 2:30 to 3:30 with Dr. Katie Albrecht from SaneFX. Thank you everyone for taking the time to join and learn with us, and take good care, everyone.